Hello everyone, and welcome to my virtual Senior Capstone presentation. I want to thank you all for virtually attending. I regret not being able to see you in all of this right at the end, but we will do the best with what we have. So today I'm going to talk to you about zero-knowledge proofs. First of all, my goal in this research project was not only to explore the zero-knowledge proofs and learn many examples to be able to explain to you all, but also to learn enough to create my own zero-knowledge proof. I wasn't really sure that I was going to be able to do this, but it turned out that I could, and I have some to show you. And lastly, to know where zero-knowledge proofs can be found. So first, to talk about proofs. Proofs are everywhere, especially in mathematics. They are basically the building blocks. Essentially, we start out with a list of facts and we combine them in new and exciting ways, and we get out a new fact that we can then use in further proofs. So let's say that I want to prove X. I present you, or the reader, with facts that we can all agree upon and show logical inferences from them that lead us, or the reader, to X. The facts and their inferences are the evidence of X and can be verified. Let's look at an example of a proof. Let's say I want to prove the statement 45,441 is not a prime number. First, I would tell you the fact that prime numbers have no factors, or maybe you would already know this, and then I would present you with a factorization, namely 297 times 153. These two facts combined tell us, or we can infer from these two facts, that the statement is indeed true, that 45,441 is indeed not a prime number. But my proof teaches you more than just the statement I set out to prove. It shows you a factorization of the number. Now this raises an interesting theoretical question, and that is it possible to prove a statement without giving away any extra information? Now, if the answer to this question was no, then this presentation would be pretty dull and also pretty short. So this question was asked and answered by Goldwasser, Micali, and Rackoff in 1989. They published an article in a magazine called The Knowledge Complexity of Interactive Proof Systems, and within it they developed a theory of knowledge within the proof. And we'll talk about this more later, but the theory of knowledge comes down to how much work you put into finding that piece of knowledge. They also outline some examples of zero-knowledge proof systems, especially the quadratic residuosity and non-residuosity zero-knowledge proof, which we will get to last because it is by far the hardest. So let's start out with the zero-knowledge proof that you will find if you look into zero-knowledge proofs yourself. It is commonly referred to as the easiest to understand, and that's why we're starting with it. So before us is Bob, and Bob is colorblind, and he holds two pills. He cannot tell the difference between these two pills because he is red-green colorblind and they're red and green, but we, as Alice, can tell the difference, for we are not colorblind. We can see that in his right hand he has the red pill, and in his left hand he has the bluish-green pill. We want to prove to Bob that we can tell what the color is without telling Bob what the color is. So we devise a system. We say, Bob, put your hands behind your back and either switch which hands the pills are in, or don't switch which hands the pills are in. And he puts his hands behind his back, and he either switches or doesn't switch them, and then shows them back to us. Being Alice and being not colorblind, we can tell that he switched which pills were in which hand. And we can tell him, Bob, you switched the pills. And since he switched them, he remembers and he knows that we are probably telling the truth. But there is one problem with this system. That problem is that we could have guessed whether he switched or not. I mean, essentially it came down to a coin flip, which one he did. So we solved this problem by asking him over and over and over and over again to keep putting the pills behind his back and switching them or not switching them, and then showing us and us telling him what he did. And after a while, we have this sequence of switches and non-switches, as you can see here. And the only way that we really would have been able to tell him the correct sequence is if we truly did have this knowledge that we are trying to prove that we have. So I have a demonstration that I created in Python for this example, and I'll show that to you now. I think the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to have multiple files, like screen recording the demonstrations separately from the PowerPoint. So at this point, you can open the first demonstration. So here's my program. In front of us, we have two colored balls, red and green, for the red-green colorblind, similar to the pills that Morpheus was holding. And we'll click anywhere, and initially we can see that they did not switch, so we tell the program that they stayed. Now already we can see that the program's confidence that we were not guessing is 50% chance, since there was a 50% chance that we got it right if we were guessing. Now the last thing that happened was it switched, so I say that it switched. And the degree of confidence went up by another 50% chance, 50%. Or I should say the amount of doubt that he had was multiplied by a half, bringing it from 50% to 25%. You can think about this as there are 4 possible sequences of switched, 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 stayed, 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 or stayed, switched. And we chose the 1 out of 4, making up the 25% chance that if we were guessing, we got it correct. I'm pretty sure it was switched. Oh, no. So let's start that again. Stayed, stayed, switched, and on, and so on. Now you can see already that this number is fairly rapidly approaching 100% confidence, and it will do so until it reaches, I think, 10 or 12 digits of 9s, at which point it will say 100%. And for something secure like a cryptocurrency or a bank account, you probably want like some 10,000 iterations of this, but for something like a demonstration, I think 13 is sufficient to say that this program should be reasonably confident that we were telling the truth. I've also made a demonstration where we are going to try to cheat and try to convince Bob that we aren't colorblind and we know the colors of the balls despite not knowing the colors of the balls. So we start out already, they're the same color, there's no way we could possibly have known whether they switched or not, so we have to guess. And it happened that there was a 50% chance and I guessed correctly. And there you go. That was pretty quick. It's really difficult to get this to go any farther than about 90. Yep. So it's a good protocol for cheaters. It weeds them out pretty quickly. Welcome back to the PowerPoint. Now that we've seen one zero-knowledge proof, we're going to take a look at the second sort of beginner zero-knowledge proof. And this one is referred to as the Alibaba's Cave ZKP because it is somewhat based on the Alibaba and the 40 Thieves story. So here is Bob and Alice, with whom we will become very familiar. Bob and Alice have a cave, and inside the cave there is a door here, and Alice claims to know the secret password to this door. We all know it's Open Sesame, but Bob doesn't know that because he's never read the story. And Alice tells Bob, I'm going to prove to you that I know that secret password. So again, they devise a system. The system goes like this. Alice enters the cave through an entrance of her choice. In this example, Alice happened to choose the upper path. It doesn't matter which one she goes in because we're going to repeat this over and over just like the other proof. And Bob goes to the entrance and he yells through the hall, come out of the second entrance. So the only way that Alice will be able to truly come out of the second entrance is if she knows the password to this door. So she uses her knowledge of the passcode and says open sesame, opens the door, and she can come out of entrance 2 for Bob to see. Note that she could have successfully guessed which entrance he was going to say. It's not what I have shown here, but it could happen, just as we could have guessed the colors of the balls, or whether they switched or stayed at random. And this problem is solved by repeating this process over and over until Bob is completely satisfied that Alice could not have possibly guessed that many times in a row. This brings us to the notion of an iterative proof. We have already talked about how in the previous proofs we've had to iterate them and repeat them, but here it is in writing. Essentially, an iterative proof is repeated until Bob, the verifier, is satisfied with his degree of calculated confidence. After the first iteration of iterative zero-knowledge proof, the probability that Alice correctly guessed is a half. After the second, it's a half times a half, a quarter. After I iterations, there is a 1/2 to the I chance that the prover was guessing. And since 1/2 is less than or equal to a half, the series converges to 0, or as close to 0 as Bob is willing to go. Another way you can imagine this idea is with a probability tree. Each of these splits, each of them has 2, is a 50% chance of, let's say, going right is switched and going left is stayed in our Morpheus example. And at the bottom you have each sequence of switched and stayed, each possible sequence. The probability of getting to the correct ending branch is 1 out of the number of ending branches that there are. In this case, there is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so 2 to the 5th. That's 32 possible branches, but only one of them is the correct path. And if you do have the knowledge that you're setting out to prove that you have, this will be an easy task. But if you don't, you're basically blindly navigating a labyrinth here. So now that we've seen a couple of basic zero-knowledge proofs, we can talk about what attributes there are of a zero-knowledge proof. To start, they are complete. This means that if the prover, Alice, is being honest, that each iteration, the verifier will accept her answer with probability 1. This is to say that if Alice is not colorblind, she can see color, that she will be able to correctly guess whether or not he switched them or didn't every single time. And this happens to be true. Next, zero-knowledge proof is sound. If the prover is lying, if they're being dishonest, then the verifier will reject with a probability of at least a half for each iteration. This was also exemplified in those proofs, and we just talked about it with that probability tree, where it will be it's a 50% chance of a guess. And lastly, the verifier must not gain the full amount of knowledge that the prover works with. So again, with the colorblind example, Alice is working with the colors, the known colors of those balls, and the verifier, in repeating the proof, no matter how many times they repeat it, they will not learn what the color of the ball is, only that the prover knows the color. In one of the professor's lecture notes, Barak here had a nice quote where he said, "The spirit of the definition is that a proof is zero knowledge if whatever Bob learns, he could have learned by himself without any interaction with Alice." Of course, Bob knows whether he switched or didn't switch the things behind his back. It's a pretty trivial thing to know as the verifier. Now we move on to a somewhat more complicated zero-knowledge proof. I would call it the intermediate level. And I really like this zero knowledge proof because it is a lot different than the other ones that we will look at. If you aren't familiar with the map coloring problem, it is stated how many colors are needed to properly color any map of connected nodes such as this one, such that no two adjacent nodes are colored with the same color. And the answer to that question is 4. And that creates a zero knowledge proof. Our goal as provers is to prove that we know the proper map coloring with 4 colors without giving away that coloring. So the first step is to actually have the proper map coloring with 4 colors. And here's one possibility. Next, we dip into my vast collection of bowler hats and we hat the map, covering each and every node with another bowler hat. We then allow Bob to remove adjacent pairs of bowler hats, revealing adjacent pairs of nodes, so he can check that each pair that he uncovers is indeed properly colored. Now, by only removing 2 adjacent pairs, he is certainly not uncovering or revealing the knowledge contained underneath all of the bowler hats, but he does gain some knowledge, no more than he could figure out given 2 nodes on his own. I mean, you only have to color them 2 different colors at a time. We let him take another pair and another pair off. The important part of this step is that he does not reveal the full amount of knowledge of the graph. So we only let him take off a certain number of pairs, which you could calculate. If Bob is unsatisfied with the degree of confidence that he has in your proper map coloring, then there is something that we can do. We can create a permutation of the proper map coloring, which is very easy. You just take all the blues to purples, or all the blacks to white, something like that, and it creates this sort of new map, but it contains the same knowledge that we had before. Just like before, we had the map, and we allow him to remove pairs of bowler hats. Again, we have to remain confident that the number of pairs that we allow him to remove will not give him too much extra knowledge. There is a point where we cannot allow him to take off any extra hats, and he will just have to deal with that amount of confidence that he has. But if this graph or this map had some thousands of nodes, then it might take a really long time before we grow worried about him gaining some of our knowledge. And he continues to unhat pair, a pair, and another pair. Now we move on to the more difficult zero-knowledge proofs. This one is the Hamiltonian circuit, or the Hamiltonian path zero-knowledge proof. If you are unfamiliar with what a Hamiltonian circuit is, it is a path through a graph such as this one that traverses every single node and only goes through each node one time. It happens that this particular graph doesn't have a circuit, which is a complete loop. It only has a path, which has a beginning and an end node. So let's talk about the zero-knowledge proof around this. To start out, this graph is shared. Anyone can look at it. After all, the circuit or the path isn't visible just by looking at it. That the knowledge of the path is the secret that we're trying to keep. And we keep that in private. So the first step is to have a permutation. And a permutation is just moving around in space where these nodes are, so that someone looking at the new permuted graph, which is on the right, can't really see how it came from the original. In this case, we did basically a right shift to all the nodes and moved them accordingly. Then we, without labels, send the permuted graph to the verifier. And the verifier asks us one of two things. he sends a challenge bit. This comes up in the sort of coding part of it, but we're gonna refer to the challenge bits as b equals 0 or b equals 1. And those challenge bits represent two possible questions that Bob is asking us. Either Bob sends b equals 0, and in which case we will show the path solved on the permuted graph that we sent him, proving that we do have knowledge of a path. And if Bob sends us b equals 1, then we uncover the nodes, the node labels, to prove to Bob that what we sent him was in fact a permutation of the original graph, which we both share. Now, the reason for these two possible questions is that we are either proving to Bob that the new permuted graph that we gave him is truly a transformation of the original, or that on the transformation of the original, we know the Hamiltonian path. This is a chart to sort of explain what I just said. We have A on the top left, and that represents our unsolved graph. The secret that we're trying to keep is the solution to that graph, namely the Hamiltonian path, and that we can call B. So we come up with a perturbation, and it brings us to a permuted graph. Call it A prime. Now, the process that we went through to get to the permuted graph is the same process that you would go through to turn your solved graph, or the Hamiltonian path, into the permuted solution to call it B prime of A prime. It's very inexpensive for us to permute a graph, as it is very expensive for us to permute the solution to the graph. So we don't have to do very much extra work for this portion of the proof. And once we have all of this information that's in front of us, Bob asks us for one of two things. He asks us for the permutation that we used, which will bring A to A prime, or vice versa, or he asks us to show that we can solve the permutation. If he asks us to solve the permutation, then he's fairly sure, or he isn't 100% sure, I should say, that what we were solving was really a permutation. But that's why there was a 50% chance that he could have sent us the challenge bit b equals 0, in which case we would be forced to show him the permutation itself. Now, because he can ask either one of those things, he should be confident that if we're showing him the solution, that it is the solution to a truly permuted version of the original. And if we show him a truly permuted version of the original, then he can be reasonably confident that we would have given him a solution had he asked for it. Once I thoroughly understood the Hamiltonian proof, and I could do something like create the previous slide that you saw, I realized that that scheme could be applied to other things. And when I started meeting with Dr. Brackey for my capstone presentation meetings, I told him that I wanted to be able to come up with my own zero-knowledge proof, and he challenged me with a zero-knowledge proof in which we share a polynomial with the verifier, and we try to prove to the verifier that we know the zeros of that polynomial without giving them away. So that's the goal in the zero-knowledge proof that I am about to explain, and everything that you're about to see is my own creation. So the graph that we see on the right is of f of x equals x cubed minus x squared plus 4/27. I chose this graph because it has nice zeros, negative 1/3 and positive 2/3, and that second one just barely kisses the x-axis, and I liked that. So just like the Hamiltonian, we come up with a permutation of our graph. I had a little bit of trouble coming up with a permutation that would preserve the number of zeros, I guess, was the main concern. And I did that by permuting the input variable x by a linear transformation. So we plug in that ax minus b in for the x variable in our old equation, and from there all we have to do is choose an a and a b. In this case I chose a to be pi and b to be 7. Once you simplify, it doesn't look much more simple. The h of x, the permutation, you get some ugly polynomial like you see up here. The unsimplified version is down below, but if we were to send our verifier that exact equation, then he might be able to see what's going on and what we did to the old polynomial to get this new permuted one. So the graph of the new polynomial h of x is in front of you. It still has 2 zeros, just like before. I didn't calculate what they are, but that's not really important here. Just like in the Hamiltonian, Bob sends us the challenge bit, and if he sent us a 0, just like before, we show that we know the zeros on our permuted graph, but by telling him he does not learn the zeros on the original, of course. And if he sends us b equals 1, then we explain to him what we did to the old graph to get the new permuted one. And he can verify for himself that we were in fact telling the truth. And our proof of our knowledge works much the same way as it did for the Hamiltonian. Either we convince him that we know the zeros of this new problem, or we convince him that this new problem is in fact a permutation of the original problem. And now we move on to the monster, quadratic residues. I didn't know what a quadratic residue was before approaching this subject, and I don't expect you to either. I think it's something that's used in physics sometimes, but I'm not really exactly sure what it's used for, so let's cover what a quadratic residue is. Let's let n be any positive integer. Then x is a quadratic residue mod n if there exists some number w, an integer also, such that x equals w squared mod n. I couldn't really find a graphic that would truly capture what x is to n. You just kind of have to stare at this equation here in the middle for long enough to understand what x is in relation to n. Now, the way that you compute quadratic residues of a number is you take every single number less than n, every integer, a positive integer, and you square it, and you mod by n, and then you get a long list of quadratic residues. So let's see an example. 39 is a quadratic residue mod 61. We know this because if we take 51 and square it, you get 2,601. 2,601 mod 61 is 39. Therefore, 39 is a quadratic residue mod 61. To get a feel for how many residues, quadratic residues, a number n can have, here's a graphic. On the bottom, we have n, the modulo, and on the y-axis, we have x, ironically, x being the quadratic residues. And you can see that once n becomes pretty large, there are a lot of quadratic residues. Take 20, for example. 20 has 5 quadratic residues. Not too many. 1 squared, of course, 2, 3, 4 squared, they're all less than 20, so the mod doesn't really come into play. 5 squared is 25, that gives us 5 as a quadratic residue. 6 squared is 36, gives us 16. 7 squared is 49, mod 20 is 9. 8 squared, 64, mod 20 is 4. 9 squared, 81, mod 20, it's 1. And you'll notice that if you keep going, you go to 11. 11 squared is 121, that gives you 1. 12 squared is 144, that gives you 4. 13 squared is 169, mod 20, 9, and so on. It's symmetric about n over 2. I missed 10 there. 10 gives you 0, but if you are always starting with 0, then 0 is every number is quadratic residue. So that's a trivial case. But what if we picked a big number, especially a big prime number with no factors? There are quite a few quadratic residues of a number like 10,321. Quite a lot. So now that we have our knowledge, or a bazillion quadratic residues mod some large prime number like 10,321, we can go about trying to prove that we know the quadratic residues without giving away any more information than Bob can compute on his own, given the amount of time that we spent together anyway. So in the top right corner, we have a reminder of what a quadratic residue is. In this case, X is a quadratic residue mod n, and W is its generator, fitting the variables that we will use in our public statement with Bob, which is that X is a quadratic residue mod n. And this is the statement that we will be trying to prove. So privately, we, as Alice, know the generator for X, W. So the first step, besides deciding the statement and knowing the private knowledge about that statement, we are going to choose U, a random quadratic residue mod n, and we're going to send Bob the quadratic residue that U generates. So we square U, we mod it, call it Y, and we send that to Bob. That is a new quadratic residue. Bob again sends us a challenge bit, 0 or 1. If Bob sent us a 0, we give Bob the generator for what we told him was a quadratic residue, which was U. If Bob sent us a 1, then we send Bob W, the generator for the public statement, X, times U, the generator for the quadratic residue that we just sent him. And the way that he verifies this is if we send him U, then he checks that U squared is indeed the number that we sent him, Y. And if we sent him W times U, then he checks that X, the quadratic residue that W generated, times Y, the quadratic residue that U generated, is indeed W times U mod n, which it will be if all was correct and those were indeed quadratic residues. Now that was very confusing for me the first time I read it, and the second time and the third time. It took like several weeks of reading this thing periodically to sort of see what was happening, and I even had to make the demonstration that you're about to see before I fully understood what was going on here. And still I don't technically fully understand because I cannot write the proofs for completeness and the proofs for soundness and the proof for zero knowledge that you will not see. If you are interested in seeing them, the reference for the GMR, the Goldwasser, Micali, and Rackoff paper is at the end of the presentation, and you're welcome to review it in your own time. But now I'm going to show you the demonstration of the quadratic residue zero knowledge proof in the Python program that I made. Now to demonstrate the zero knowledge proof of quadratic residues to hopefully make a little bit more sense of that confusing protocol with the generalized form. So to start out, we have to have some quadratic residues. So we decide initially to use mod 61 to start out with a pretty small number. And just so you know, the 0 that I put in there was simply for the format of how we are viewing these residues. If I had put in a 1, you can see that we get the list separately, but for our purposes, we would rather see the root and the generator right next to each other. So now we can jump into our protocol. The n we have already decided is 61, and normally this x would get decided by the program. I happened not to code it that way, but that's okay. We can choose any old quadratic residue of 61. Let's call it 19. And let's remember that 43 generates that quadratic residue 19. Now the program reminds us of our statement, which is that 19 is a quadratic residue mod 61. And he tells us that the program doesn't know W, the generator for 19, but we do. And then we are asked to choose any random quadratic residue of n, call it U, and provide the program with the quadratic residue generated by that quadratic residue. So we take a quadratic residue like 45 and we square it and mod it. So we got a challenge bit of 0, so we were asked to give the program the quadratic residue that generated the one that we gave him. In this case, it's this 45 right here. And he can easily check that we were telling the truth about that, and we passed. So the confidence starts at 50%. And we're asked to choose another random quadratic residue. So let's give it 57 this time. But remember, 57 squared and modded. We got a random challenge bit of 1, and so we have to give it the root of the original x, the original quadratic residue here, times the generator for the last one that we gave it, which is 57 times the generator for 19 was, if we remember, 43. And don't forget to mod. And we passed again. And let's see if we can't get this a little bit higher. We choose another random, let's say 48, generated by 32. And we find that quadratic residue that 48 gives us. Mod 61. And we got random key 1 this time. So we have to do our generator quadratic residue times the generator of the original statement once again. And that number that generated 19 again was 43, and the one that generated y, which we just gave it, was 48. So we take 48 times 43, mod it 61, and we passed again. And you can continue this indefinitely until Bob is satisfied. So now I've shown you all that I can in terms of examples of zero-knowledge proofs. And the last two, the Hamiltonian and the quadratic residue, being extremely complicated, are the only ones that are viable to be applied in real-world applications, which we're about to talk about. There are 3 main ways that zero-knowledge proofs are applied, but we're only going to talk about 2 of them because the third one is extremely complicated. The first one is identification schema. So you can imagine that if you have a PIN code box, or even a card scanning box outside of some secret location, and you want to keep this box secure, of course, then you aren't going to want everyone to be able to see someone putting in the PIN code, nor do you want someone to be able to look inside of the box for long enough to see what passcode that they are looking for. So one way to get around this is to put inside the box the instance of a very difficult problem. For instance, have the box need to be proven to that 39 is a quadratic residue mod 61. And then it will go through the protocol that you just watched between the prover and the box itself to determine whether or not the person trying to access this box or unlock the box truly does know the answer to that problem. Another application in terms of identification schema might be if you want to prove to someone that you truly do have an account at your bank, then one way you can do that is by traveling to your bank and having the verifier verify that when you withdraw money from the ATM, it in fact works and you can get the money out. This is a pretty unrealistic example. In reality, you might do something like log in to your bank account and then have the verifier see that you had the successful login text output. Lastly, the application that sort of stood out to me was cryptocurrency. Cryptocurrency initially gained a lot of popularity because it seemed to be a way to privately send and receive money. But the truth is that is false. Everyone has the history of the piece of cryptocurrency that they have. That history includes who spent it, when they spent it, and who they sent it to. And if you know much about blockchain, the way that blockchains remain consistent is that essentially everyone has that piece of information about the currency, and you can check it against many other computers and verify it. But that means that if I'm trying to privately send or receive money, then someone can go in and look at the history of that cryptocurrency and see that I spent it, and that's not very private. So one way that you can get around that using zero-knowledge proofs is to prove that you know the history of that piece of cryptocurrency without giving away exactly what that history was. And there is actually a cryptocurrency that you can see here called Zcash that implements that exact concept. So now I have succeeded in all of the goals that I set out to, and here are my references. The top one is the Goldwasser, Micali, and Rackoff paper, which I referenced mostly. And also what was a really big help was Barak's lecture notes from Harvard University, where he essentially talked about the GMR paper extensively. And I want to thank everyone, first of all, who is listening for watching this presentation. I appreciate it very much, and I can't wait to hear your questions and feedback. I want to thank Dr. Brackey, especially for helping me so much with this project, and his long list of possibilities for capstones, because this was one of them, and I think I picked a really good one. I had a lot of fun. And I want to thank Dr. Wills for being a great professor and just the math department itself, because I feel like I've gotten a lot more into mathematics since I got here, and I truly love doing it. And all my friends and classmates. Thank you so much.